Okay, Elissa, are you ready? Okay, quick intro. Welcome to, what is this, the third CIF seminar of this academic year. I'm super happy to have Elissa Redmiles here from the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. And Elissa is going to talk about a topic that is a bit beyond the typical framework of this seminar. So we're having sex, work, and technology lessons for internet governance and digital safety. Elissa, the floor is yours. We are all looking forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So today I would like to talk about the use of technology for sex work and the role that both like internet governance as well as security and privacy play and can play potentially in the future. And this is work in collaboration with a bunch of great folks who are listed here, and then the relevant papers are listed throughout the talk. So as a bit of background, sex workers make up a sizable portion of the global workforce. So it is hard to accurately measure the number of sex workers because this is a very stigmatized profession and because there are different definitions of sex work in various different places. But the best estimates that we have come from the UN, and they estimate that sex workers make up about 0.5% of the global population. And sex work is highly criminalized and stigmatized. So in this figure here, you can see in red the countries where sex work is criminalized, in blue, which you see very little of, where it's regulated, and in green, where it is decriminalized, and orange is where it's sort of partially criminalized. So you can see it's a very criminalized and or stigmatized kind of landscape. Sorry, I'm getting used to a new slide platform. And sex workers use technology for their work in many different ways. So there's online-only sex work. These are things like OnlyFans, which has gained a lot of popularity during the pandemic. This is a site where both sex workers and non-sex workers can sell content, so like pictures, videos, texting services, etc. But it's estimated that a vast majority of the content there is sex work related, and online only sex work tends to be legal. So like in the United States, where certain forms of in-person sex work are illegal, online sex work like OnlyFans is perfectly legal. And then there are also things like Chatterbait or other kind of camming websites. On the other side, people also use technology for their digital advertising or even communicating with clients. And this is true for both online sex work as well as in-person sex work. So this could be like folks who are doing stripping doing this, or folks who are doing escorting as well doing this. And this is true, in countries like Germany, where sex work is legalized. People can work out of brothels, but they're still going to be doing kind of advertising and trying to keep up with their clients. And then in places where the work might be illegal, folks are also still doing advertising and communication online. Okay, so today's focus is about the intersection of sex work and technology. And prior to this study, there had been very little work on how sex workers were using technology, and in particular, little work on the safety and security side of what was going on. And the way that I got interested in this work in the first place actually was because I kept sort of hearing in the security and privacy community, if end users understood the risks better, then they would use security behaviors. And I wasn't so sure that that was necessarily true, but I thought that one of the better ways to figure out whether that was true and whether the kind of protective tools that we were offering were actually effective was to study a population that had really salient risks. And sex workers have very tangible risks. We'll get to some of those are later, but things like stalking, physical harm, loss of housing, etc. And unlike other sort of high-risk populations that we study, like say journalists, they don't have any sort of like workplace training about digital security. And then so in that way, sex workers are really kind of like regular end users, but with much more salient risks. And so that was kind of how I got into this project, although it turned out that there were a lot of other interesting angles that I'll hopefully try to touch on today. Okay, so the first two studies that I'm going to present are from a 2-year-long research project in 3 countries where sex work is regulated and legal: Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And we did interviews and then follow-up surveys with sex workers in, the interviews were only in Germany and Switzerland, and then surveys were in all 3 countries. And because of the sensitivity of this population, we conducted our interviews via end-to-end encryption, and we allowed people to decide whether they wanted to do like a chat-only interview, phone interview, or video interview. And part of the reason the study took kind of a long time was it took us a while to do recruitment, because we had to gain sort of trust in the population in order to be able to recruit folks. We also wanted to make sure that our methodology was appropriate for the population we're working with. And so we had a sex worker who was a consultant who reviewed sort of our protocol and our study materials to make sure that we kind of did everything as ethically as possible. And what we asked people about in these interviews and surveys was about both their kind of general use of technology for their work, as well as, how did they define safety, how technology played a role in safety, and what kind of digital tools they were using or lacking. And so the first thing we find is that there are like 6 ways that in-person sex workers, so escorts or folks working in massage parlors, etc., use or want to use technology. So they use technology for advertising, as I previously mentioned. They also use it for vetting their clients. So because there's a high degree of physical safety risk, they want to know who it is who's coming to meet with them. And so there are certain websites where other sex workers can leave reviews about particular clients, for example, like if an assault occurred or etc., because the police are not always safe for them to turn to. Or they also may ask clients to say send an email from their workplace email address, so they have some way of kind of tracking them down if something happens, so on and so forth. They also, as I mentioned, use technology to communicate with their clients, to receive payments. So while there's some cash payment, people also receive and want to receive digitally based payments. They also use technology to form community and support and educate each other, and that has a large role in staying safe. And finally, they do activism. So while sex work is legal in all 3 of these countries, the thing about sex work is there's an ever-changing kind of regulatory landscape. And so it's very common that sex workers will have to kind of speak up and lobby not to have their work become criminalized or not to have regulations that might harm them. And one of the things that we found as we were studying workers' use of technology for these purposes was that a lot of the technologies they were trying to use encoded American moral values and imposed those views on the sex workers who we were studying who are actually working legally. So for example, one of the participants said, being able to use PayPal would be great, but sex work is forbidden on PayPal. And so I've had colleagues who use PayPal and then they got blocked for life. And sometimes when you get blocked for life, all of the money that you have in PayPal is seized. And so, sex work is forbidden on PayPal, ostensibly maybe because it's illegal in the US, or at least because it's very unacceptable in the US. But these are folks who are registered, say, with the German government, they're paying taxes, they still can't use this service. Another person said, I had a lot of followers on Instagram, and at some point, I didn't even post nudes or anything. At some point, my Instagram was just deleted. So that definitely hurt my business, but that was, pretty shitty. And this is something that we heard a lot, which was, hey, I just have an account on this platform, and still my content or my account is getting taken down, even if I'm not using it for work. And one participant kind of summed things up in what I thought was a very salient way, which is to say, so as someone who offers proactive erotic services, you're clearly at a disadvantage in the American-dominated internet. there's censorship and restrictions. And so beyond this, as was the case with the person on Instagram, what we find is that, the technology and these sort of policies that are in place, they're actually regulating people's identity, not just the work that they do on the platform. And one example of this is Airbnb, and we are not the only people to surface this. So I have this article from Vice, who originally broke this story a couple of years before we did our work, which is we were hearing reports from multiple participants that they couldn't use Airbnb. And one participant said, I even have 3 different devices that I use. I have one for work, I have one for personal, and I have one just for Airbnb. And still I get my Airbnb account closed all the time. And it turns out that Airbnb has a patent for a particular type of machine learning software that purports to detect whether someone works in the sex industry, also whether they have certain mental conditions. And in their terms of service, they can ban offering services to folks that they deem unacceptable, even if those folks are not trying to do some sort of work or activity in the Airbnb. And so, that means that folks who are from all over the world who may be working in a legal context, aren't able to use kind of common services. And similarly, this also prevents them from being able to create communities. So for example, Instagram and a few other platforms recently changed their terms of service to say that you can't have any communities or content that facilitates, encourages, or coordinates commercial sexual services. And so this means educational material about how to use VPNs if you are a sex worker, if it's sort of sex work related or in any way kind of clear that that's part of the effort, those kind of communities will be taken down. And so this is really restricting people's access to safety support as well. Okay, and it's not just sort of the sort of non-adult tech that's causing harm. We also heard reports about adult industry platforms that were causing harm as well. So for example, one participant said, yeah, there was this one platform that took my advertisements out of physical newspapers or flyers and put them on the internet without asking. And so all of a sudden, they would get calls from clients who were expecting very different services than the services they offered. And one of the big kind of forms of safety that we'll touch on is being able to set appropriate boundaries with clients. That's one of the ways of staying safe. And so when content gets stolen and placed online and ads get kind of remade with the same contact information, that can be very harmful. And these platforms are just kind of trying to drive ads, traffic, or et cetera for themselves. And so another person said, yeah, there's this website, it would make ads for you. It finds your website, it takes your stuff, and it just makes an ad. And they would then try to sell these ads back to the workers. They'd say, oh, look how much traffic we're getting on this ad that we made of you, now pay us for it. And this person said, yeah, that felt like an invasion of privacy because they'd gone in and they'd read my stuff and they weren't intending to book. And then they made this weird ad and tried to sell it to me. And then the other thing is that even the adult industry platforms are not necessarily built with sex workers in mind. So for example, one participant said, I'm transmasculine. And so most of the clients and most of the websites for advertising are set up for cis women. And so many of the platforms don't allow me to advertise at all. And this can prevent people from making a living, and B, can push them to sort of less safe places to get clients or to advertise. So I've talked kind of elusively a bit so far about safety. Let's actually get into the safety portion. So how are sex workers defining safety? What are their barriers to staying safe? We've touched on a few of them. And what strategies do they use to stay safe? So looking first at how sex workers define safety, what we see is that there are 7 forms of safety for sex workers. So there's physical safety, financial security, being able to set clear boundaries, as I had mentioned, privacy, legality, like being able to work in a legal context, and access to community, and finally respect, respect both from clients and from the broader world. And respect, really comes to play when we think about what do you do when there's a physical safety threat? What do you do if you had theft? Well, you want to be able to turn to legal services. And so if you are working legally, it then requires that when you turn to the officials that are supposed to help you, that they have enough respect for you that they will do so. And they won't kind of assume based on what you do for your job that it's your responsibility for that harm. So touching on physical safety, right, someone defined this as being able to work without fear of abuse or aggression. Combining physical safety with privacy, one participant said, privacy is when clients don't know my name or address. An unannounced visit from a friend would be nice. An unannounced visit from a client would be a catastrophe. In terms of financial security and its relationship with safety, one participant said, if I had financial pressure to accept jobs against my better judgment, for example, taking someone who demands services I don't offer, I would be unsafe. And finally, as I said, respect, as this person put it, is not feeling that society thinks it's normal for me to get hurt. Okay, so what are the barriers to achieving these types of safety, particularly from a technological perspective? So throughout this talk, there's sort of a broader policy context around legalization of sex work and stigma around sex work that affects many pieces of safety, but we'll focus more so on the technological pieces. So risk to safety goals, clients can be aggressive physically or in terms of demanding things and or invasive. So for example, one participant said, if you decide to close a relationship with a client, sometimes they become obsessive. A couple of times I've been blackmailed. They threatened that they'd expose my activities online to my peers or family. Others showed up at my place of work looking for me. It's very unsettling, but with the right precautions, I've learned to avoid it. I'd much rather lose money than meet someone with potential to cause problems. And this is where online vetting often comes in, where folks are trying to, kind of vet through other people in the community. Hey, is this going to be a safe client to see? Another person said, my lovely partner, who is also a photographer, photographed me a couple of times. I wasn't very smart, and I published my photos with his tag, like his watermark, on a relatively public forum. And then a client of mine who was very fond of me, which I also wasn't totally aware of, did some research and figured out who my boyfriend is. He found our places of business and then, of course, knew what we do in our free time, what our names are. Since then, I pay very close attention to which tag is on the pictures. And so this is, sort of a classic case of digital privacy, digital safety, online stalking that then becomes real world. As I mentioned, sex work advertising sites can also be predatory. The laws regulating sex work and business, including online business, can create exposure risks. So for example, in Germany, we have a law that says that if you have a website, it has to be registered to a name. And so if a sex worker, say, wants to host a website for their business, they would have to put this impressum statement on the website, kind of saying who they were, what their address is. And so sex work organizations in Germany have come together to be able to offer to their community members that the organization contact information can be put on their website instead of the personal contact information. And this is something where, it's a law that wasn't maybe intended to cause harm, but has these potential repercussions. And this is where it's very important for us to be in dialogue with community members to understand how these things can affect them, because otherwise we have no way of knowing whether this could cause harm. Finally, as I had mentioned as well, right, online platforms discriminating against sex workers, not necessarily discriminating against the work, but discriminating against the identity, can facilitate risk, especially through lack of access to community or lack of access to certain like essential services. And just kind of one more quote that someone said about Airbnb, right? Airbnb bans workers just for being sex workers. They have not shown their face, they don't use the same email or phone, and they don't work from Airbnb, and still they got banned. And these kinds of risks are intersectional, right? It's not that one risk, only threatens, your financial safety or et cetera. It often threatens like a whole series of things. And so there's evidence, right, that the ability to work online or to at least advertise online and so forth has improved the physical safety of sex workers. But at the same time, lacks of access to digital payment systems, like we talked about PayPal, not allowing payments, reduces people's physical safety because when there's high volumes of cash payments, there can often be robberies. Criminals know, I know that, in the brothels, there's going to be a lot of cash being exchanged. I'm going to wait outside for people. And it also threatens people's financial security. When you go to your landlord and you want to pay with, a big stack of cash, in certain places, that's going to ring some red flags versus being able to make a money transfer. And there are certain issues, not just with digital payments, but with banks as well, depending on the country. And so many people in this population may be unbanked, which can cause all sorts of compounding issues. As I mentioned, banning communities from discussing sex work prevents access to safety or harm reduction information, and also just to that essential need for community that all of us have probably discovered more so over the past number of months. And finally, theft of IP and advertising content can lead to these boundary violations that in turn threaten physical safety and are also violating of digital privacy. So all of these things are sort of intersectional in how they affect folks. Okay, but what do people do about it right now, right? Like the original question I came into this with was, are they using the digital security tools that we have? Are those effective for preventing some of these harms? What we see is that for in-person work, folks are doing vetting, as I mentioned, and they're also doing something that our participants called covering. And this is something that folks do when they are online dating as well, where they will tell a friend or a colleague, here are the details of my appointment. This is who I'm going to meet. Here is where I'm going to meet them. If you don't hear from me in this amount of time, do ABC things. Check in with me, call this person, comes to my house, so on and so forth. So this is a safety strategy people are doing, and sometimes using like GPS tracking on their phone that they'll share with a friend, etc. People did a bit use security and privacy settings, but it certainly wasn't the majority of people. And the reason for this was they do not trust the settings to actually work the way that they purport to. And for populations that have a really high risk, if there's a software bug in that setting and it doesn't work the way it was supposed to, that's a really big problem because it can lead to someone showing up at your house. It can lead to your landlord discovering what you do and kicking you out, even if it's legal work, so on and so forth. And so people said, I think it doesn't matter if you have these settings or not. When I talk about something, I make sure there isn't a phone in the room. And in addition to this, a number of people said, well, I actually just use different devices because that I trust a lot more than trying to have these settings. In general, few sex workers used technical security tools. So about a third used encrypted chat, not very many used VPN, and then even less for encrypted email, Tor, password managers, or cryptocurrency. And part of the reason for this, particularly like people often ask me Why not cryptocurrency? It seems like it would solve the payment problems. There's a two-sided relationship here. So it's both whether the sex worker is willing to use cryptocurrency, as well as whether the client is willing to do so. And so one of the folks who talked about cryptocurrency said, well, I'd love to use that, but my clients have no interest in figuring it out, and I'm not really in a position to make them do so. And so, that's one of the considerations for these security tools, is it's not just about whether the individual wants to use it, but there's sort of a two-way relationship here. And so, as someone said, I would gladly do all of these things that you listed here, but that really only works when the customers participate. So using encrypted chat or encrypted email or cryptocurrency. If the customer just wants to send you a text message, you have to make the choice between your financial safety and things like housing and food and these kind of security tools. Identity management is very important, especially given lack of trust in security and privacy settings and lack of use of other security tools. So people will use an alias for work, so different email address, phone number, so forth. And a high proportion, so 2/3, use a separate account or device. And a lot of these folks are people who use separate devices. And one of the participants said, well, it's really time consuming and it's annoying. It's stressful having all these phones and personas and things I have to remember. And I'm like, shit, did I miss that I, put this up on the wrong phone all the time? And what this means is, right, so if I have my personal phone, I can't check to see if I got messages from my client on there, because that might, link my identity. And so now I have to go switch to a different phone to see if I got messages, so on and so forth. And so this is a lot of kind of mental strain, and people, A, do make mistakes, or B, eventually give up. And we certainly heard some resignation that was like, something might happen, but I can't deal with the stress of trying to do this. And this is where, technology tools could actually help, right? There's been calls not just for sex workers, but also for folks who are transitioning, trans folks who want to separate their identities, other cases where people want to separate their identities. And this is something we haven't seen built in yet at like a hardware level, at a level where we can really isolate and separate digital signatures. And this is going to become even more important as we start to think about new forms of media, things like virtual reality, et cetera, where your identity isn't just going to be your interaction on this one piece of hardware, but it's going to be based on all of these, sensors on your body, things that are even harder to try to deceive. It's not as simple as just having two phones, even though having two phones is also not particularly simple. People also did self-censorship. This was sort of, the traditional form of privacy settings. So people will carefully curate an online image. They'll get rid of any personal social media, anything that could connect, right? Because if I visit one social media and then the other on the same phone, we know that you will often get like Facebook suggesting one profile or the other as a friend, or clients being suggested as friends, or so on. And so about half of our survey respondents said they don't even show their face or any sort of identifying features, tattoos, birthmarks, etc., in photos that they post in their advertisements. And so they're doing really kind of like core, not reliant on tech, but analog ways of trying to protect themselves. They also sometimes will delete accounts or keep creating new accounts. So as one person said, I'm legally allowed to work, but I'm scared of getting banned from certain countries just for being a sex worker. So I remove all of my information, my accounts, my website, wipe my phone before I go travel, because immigration services in certain countries do not allow people who work in morally unacceptable jobs to enter. The US is one of these countries. As I said, there's a lot of resignation and regret around feeling guilty for not doing enough safety behaviors. even though, right, as experts, we can say, hey, these are hard behaviors to do, especially kind of homegrown without being able to rely on any tools. And so, managing all of these different identities and accounts makes people feel like mistakes are inevitable, and people know that it's hard to undo them. So one person said, I log into Kaufmisch, which is a German sex work advertising website, on my personal phone, and my Apple account from my work phone is registered to my passport name. This stuff could get me killed or deported. I'm not prepared, and I need to be careful, but sometimes it's exhausting. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at on safety, and I'll talk about at the end, what are some things that we as technologists can potentially build. But I wanted to speak briefly about what happened, what changed when the pandemic hit. So when the pandemic hit, people couldn't do work in person. And there were two reasons for that. One was there were lockdown laws and regulations. So, countries understandably said, hey, even if sex work is legal, you can't be doing in-person work during the pandemic. And one participant in a follow-up study that we did during the pandemic said, well, since the pandemic, it's been criminalized to do sex work. And so, it's now that that's been lifted, it'll be easier to work and you don't have to worry about what's going on. But before that, you did, because the police would come and find you. The other thing is that sex workers themselves, in many cases, didn't want to do work because, for example, one of our participants was immunocompromised, and so was their housemate, and they hadn't had access to vaccines yet. And so it was too risky to see clients. And then, of course, clients themselves might not be in a situation where they're able to travel or where they are comfortable seeing workers. And so all of a sudden, folks who were doing in-person work were pushed to online. And this shift to online sex work requires a larger footprint than even what people had before when we did our previous study. So our previous study was done in 2018, 2019. The one I'm talking about now was done in the winter, spring of 2021. So about a year into the pandemic. And so what people said was, well, now that I'm having to do really online sex work, I have to be on more platforms. I have to create more explicit content in order to stand out in the crowd, right? It wasn't just sex workers who started doing online sex work during the pandemic. There was also a big flood of people who lost their job in other industries who started doing online sex work. And I have to put kind of more information out there. I have to build a more robust persona, because it's not just someone like looking through a bunch of ads, deciding who they want to see in person, and then the persona exists in person. Now it's all entirely online, and so there has to be a lot more detail. And so one participant said, well, the worst thing that you have to think about with doing online work is that these videos that you make to market yourself or to sell, those can be leaked. And then all of the people around you are going to get them at some point, and they will be forever on the internet. For face-to-face or in-person work, I didn't have my intimacy compromised. If I had troubles, they were going to stay in the kind of real-world work world. With online work, people have photos and videos of everything. I won't ever be able to delete that. They'll stay floating around forever. And if I stop doing sex work in the future, that might affect me as well. Versus, we certainly heard for folks who are doing in-person work, hey, I'm doing this right now. I might float out of it again later. I need to pay some bills, etc. It's not always sort of a career. Sometimes it's a stopgap. And it's easy to just take down no-face ads. That's a lot more difficult once you start having all of this intimate content online. And I will say, thinking about the literature on people's mental models of privacy online, typical end users don't always have quite as deep of an understanding that content that they share on the internet can end up wherever. We're seeing much more awareness of that now, but still not to the same level of salience that we were seeing in our participants. So people get it, but they also need to be able to have money to pay bills and be financially secure. And so branding, basically, this online branding expands the threat model and people's risks. So still an issue with online platform discrimination, especially because with online work, we're seeing people need to advertise more on Twitter, on Instagram, etc. They're having to do so in sort of circuitous ways to get around the platforms. And then we're also seeing people trying to learn about doing online sex work safely, and again, needing access to community, which may be hard to get, and they can't go to community in person because it's the pandemic. So still those online platforms being difficult. The other thing we see is that there's greater risk of stalking and doxing because people are sharing more content. So for example, one person said, well, I took a selfie in the bathroom and I uploaded it to Twitter, and a guy went to the same bathroom and posted a selfie of him in that bathroom under mine, like to tell me I know where you are. Those stalker things are the ones that make me more scared. And this is not just, from people sharing more information, but also, right, being on more public kind of mainstream platforms as well. It's more likely that people in your regular life will stumble across your content, and that can have consequences. As I said, people are needing to create more explicit content to stand out in the crowd in order to earn a living. And as another person said, obviously there's always that concern that some of my content is going to pop up on Pornhub. That's always a risk, and part of the reason I prefer in-person sex work to online, but it's a risk you have to live with. So how do people try to stay safe? What are the new strategies they have in this kind of online work? One is that people are developing a lot of censorship evasion strategies. So in our first study, mostly people said, like I try to use, different email addresses or different devices, but there weren't that many kind of more robust evasion strategies. Now what we're seeing is a lot of evasion strategies, particularly for marketing and kind of client management. So one participant mentioned an AI tool that would claim to predict whether certain content would be censored on an online platform. So this participant said there's a page where you put a photo into the page, and it uses the same machine learning that Instagram uses, and it tells you if it's too sexy, if I can upload this to Instagram or not. And the reason that people care about this is that if you upload offending content to Instagram, there's like a scaling degree of consequences. So like the first time you have a violation, they might just take it down. The second time they might ban your account for 24 hours. The next time it might be a week. The next time it might be a month. If that's where you're getting a lot of your income or where you're connecting with other people for support, this is a problem, because if you go and make a new account, you don't have all of those followers. And so people really want to try to avoid kind of getting into an escalation situation with content being taken down. And people often don't have clear transparency from the platform about what is and isn't allowed, or as we talked about, it may be their identity as a sex worker. They don't want to get encoded as a sex worker in the platform because they may encounter issues even with that. People also were trying to kind of build up their clients, their digital clients, outside of any kind of adult industry platform or mainstream platform, so that when they did have issues with censorship, which were basically inevitable, they still had a way to contact clients, share with them a new account, build up income where a platform wasn't taking a cut, etc. And then also they started nesting their links. So for example, on TikTok, you can't link to OnlyFans. And so a lot of people will link from their TikTok to a link tree, which is like a list of links. And one of those links will be their OnlyFans. Same thing on Instagram. People will link to their Linktree and then to their OnlyFans. So people are starting to kind of bury this content that they know is going to get flagged by the platform. We're also seeing a lot more focus on IP and content protection as people are having to put more content out. People are using watermarking, DCMA tools. So DCMA is a regulation in the United States that requires the takedown of copyrighted content. And so if you have taken a photo of yourself, then you own the copyright to that photo. Now, one of the problems is if someone else takes a photo of you, like a photographer, you need to get them to write the copyright over to you in order to be able to use DCMA. Otherwise, even if it's a picture of you, it's not considered your copyright. But there are some tools that try to track your content around the internet so that you can send takedown requests if the content pops up somewhere you didn't put it. People also used Google alerts to try to see if their name was popping up, if new information was coming up. So on Google alerts, one person said, I have a Google alert for my stage name that will tell me if there's new videos of me uploaded, and I send messages to the places that upload these videos like all the time to delete it. And for DCMA takedown, one person said, well, I was going to use one particular platform because I know that platform that hosts and sells content, I know that platform will send the DCMA takedowns for you. And so as long as you work on that platform, they'll do that for you. And I think that's kind of cool. And more than being cool, sending DCMA takedown notices is a very time-consuming activity. And so being able to have tools that can track content are important. Now, as technologists, we also know that people are able to remove watermarks. They're able to modify photos and videos such that they wouldn't necessarily be detected by some of these tools unless they're pretty advanced. And so this is somewhere where there's definitely some room for safety innovation that's relevant both to the sex working community as well as many other communities that are handling IP concerns. In terms of stalking prevention, people are still sometimes doing no face or no tattoos, although in a flooded market, trying to sell content without your face, getting much more difficult. The thing that sort of rose up to more importance is as people are taking more pictures, it's becoming important to not take them in identifying locations. And like one strategy that someone used, in addition to not trying to take it in an identifiable location, was that they would post their content out of order or once they had already left a location. So, you know, unlike the person who had posted the bathroom picture on Twitter, they would only post pictures, say, of somewhere that they were not going to go again, like a different state or a different country or a different city. One person said, I have had worries because my room has a very unusual shape. And for a while I was like, oh, what if someone went through a real estate listing and found my room looks like that? That was a concern of mine. Or doing videos, what if somebody found my location because they recognized the layout of the building? People often sometimes try to shoot without any sort of natural light, so you can't tell what time of day it is, which might tell you their time zone, narrowing in on location, etc. Okay, what can we build? The first thing is tools that accommodate multiple personas and that do so from a really deep, trustworthy level, right? Not something as simple as, oh, we have privacy settings, but oops, they kind of screw up some of the time. But really like hardware level accommodation of multiple personas. What would that look like? This is important in this domain as well as many other domains. Tools that provide algorithmic transparency, not just privacy transparency, right? Because there was a lot of confusion about, you know, why is this photo taken down and not this one? This affects my ability to stay safe because I don't know what I can upload. It also affects my ability to make money because I might post like less monetarily advantageous photos out of fear. If there was more transparency about the platform governance rules and how those algorithms were working, this would help people. Are there tools that we can provide as researchers that give visibility to that, even from being outside the platform. As I mentioned, tools that allow tracking and protection of content. What would a irremovable watermark look like? Is that something that's practical? Are there open source tools that we could offer to do these kinds of things? And finally, of course, tools whose construction is led by the population they serve. So as I mentioned really early on, some of the adult industry platforms, or many of them actually, are not designed for the whole breadth of folks who are doing sex workers. They're really designed with cis women as the provider and cis men as the client. Similarly, when we're building security and privacy tools, we want to have insight and collaboration with the populations that those tools are designed to help. And this will help them have more impact as well. And finally, the thing that we can do beyond just building is empowering communities, helping people be able to design, build, and evaluate technology that serves them. This can look like hackathons, other kinds of training workshops, design workshops, etc. And one person said, honestly, I would say one of my biggest pet peeves is that almost all of the platforms that sex workers use as far as advertising and keeping ourselves safe, none of these are run by sex workers. Many of them are run by older white dudes who are profiting off of the workers, and I find that problematic in many ways. So in summary, as one participant put it, I want technology that considers me a person and not a product, but that's really asking a lot from the anonymous virtual world. And so overall, bigger kind of not just building level recommendations are we need to think about regulations around what happens when we globalize tech censorship, particularly censorship that comes from the moral values or legal guidelines of one particular country. This affects sex workers, it affects trans folks, it affects drag queens, it affects other people when we think about like real name policies, so on and so forth. So while we looked at one population here, it's much bigger than that. We want to incorporate and listen to marginalized voices in both policy development and technology development, and ideally support communities to be able to do those things themselves. Thank you. Happy to take questions or just kind of discuss now.